The old Shah, thought to be pro-German, was dethroned and replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. There was an agreement that once the war was over, the British and Soviet troops would both pull out.
When
the occupation was due to end, Stalin didn't want to leave.
У Сталина охоты уходить из Ирана не было. Он, так сказать,
He wanted to stay on.
и задержаться бы еще. И тут, конечно,
This created problems.
всякого рода
There was
сложности.
lots of pressure put on us.
Конечно, нажим
Pressure
был
from the
со
British.
стороны англичан большой.
And in fact, the Soviet Union had no legal right to stay there.
Таких легальных, законных у Советского Союза не было.
Iran presented the Security Council of the newly founded United Nations with its first crisis.
Совета Безопасности, вот уже второй день.
That's Mr. Gromyko proposing to the Security Council that the hearing of the Persian case should be postponed.
The Soviet Union tried to prevent further discussion. They lost.
Mr. Gromyko and the other Russians then walked out. Their dramatic exit seems to have caused no obvious reaction at the time, though we can imagine what most of those present were thinking. One good thing, however, emerges from this incident. The Security Council had stood its ground.
6 weeks later, Stalin ceremonially withdrew his forces from Iran. But Truman, shaken by his behavior, suspected that Stalin was aiming at world domination.
He said, I want to be in position to document our concern. Go back over the recent agreements and list one by one the violations in which the Soviets have engaged.
I was then Mr. Clifford's assistant, and he turned the task over to me. We talked about it a bit, and I said, well, it seems to me that that's only scratching the surface, a list of agreements broken. There are much more fundamental problems in our relations with the USSR than that. So let's go at it in a somewhat broader way.
We spent weeks on it then, interviewed most of the top officials in the United States.
There was absolute unanimity in all of the agencies concerned as to the nature of problems we had and the kind of response we were going to have to make.
We ended up the report by saying, the policy of our country should be set and clearly set. The Soviet Union constitutes a real menace to freedom in this world. Freedom in Europe, freedom in the United States. So we must prepare for it.
The Clifford-Elsie report was kept secret. The report concluded that a war with the USSR would be more total, more horrible than anything previously known. The United States still had the monopoly of atomic weapons. At Bikini Atoll in the Pacific, 2 atom bombs were detonated in July 1946. The warning to Stalin was plain. From now on, all the big powers worked frantically to develop their own atomic and biological weapons. At the Paris Conference of Foreign Ministers, Molotov was determined to maintain joint Allied control of Germany. But his American counterpart, Secretary of State Burns, wanted Germany to pay no more reparations. For Molotov, Burns was too concerned with German opinion. He was outraged.
Молотов господин нет. Но если бы он был
Molotov was nicknamed Mr. No,
то Сталин бы его не
but if he had been a Mr. Yes, Stalin would not have kept him
Ему
on.
не надо было господин да, ему надо было господин нет, который бы его
Stalin needed a Mr. No,
до предела,
someone capable of finding out the maximum information about the other side's position.
там всячески нажимал, выбивал.
Molotov would squeeze the other side to its absolute limit.
Когда уже понял, что
When he had
дальше
totally
нельзя,
exhausted these methods,
выходил
it was
Сталин,
Stalin's turn.
повторяю, он опять-таки
He would come back, and resolve matters with a friendly smile.
Добродушно какие-то вопросы решал.
It was at Paris that the wartime alliance began finally to break up. The Americans and the British were impatient to develop stable economies in their zones of Germany without Soviet interference.
Stuttgart, Germany, scene of an event that marks a new phase in Europe's destiny. Secretary of State James F. Burns is here to set forth the policy of the United States on Germany, a speech widely interpreted as marking the end of America's appeasement of Russia. Burns tells the Germans and the world,
it is not in the interest of the German people or in the interest of world peace that Germany should become a pawn or a partner in a military struggle for power between the East and the West.
I listened to the Burns-Stuttgart speech with marked approval because, in fact, I had written most of it. And those of us who worked on it, and Burns, were not thinking in anti-Soviet terms.
The American people want to return the government of Germany to the people of Germany. The American people want to help the German people to win their way back to an honorable place among the free and peace-loving nations of the world.
In 1945, the Allies had approved Poland's annexation of Germany's eastern provinces up to the Oder and Neisse rivers. But now Burns suggested that the new frontier was unfair to Germany and might be changed.
It was a shocking statement. It made us think that our western border was being questioned by the Germans and by other Western countries.
Jest I będzie kwestionowana przez mocarstwa zachodnie, przez Niemcy.
It was one of the most important things that strengthened our ties with the Soviet Union.
Umacniał nasze sojusznicze stosunki ze Związkiem Radzieckim.
More pictures have arrived from Moscow. They show the everyday scene in the Soviet capital's famous Red Square. And what's in their shops? Well, here's a glimpse of the sort of things now on display. These new fashions, our cameraman tells us, are so expensive that they're quite beyond the means of ordinary people in Russia today.
Ordinary people were much worse off than the newsreels showed.
It was a very hard time. I had a son who was 1.5 years old. He used to get a plate from the cupboard and walk after me saying, "Give me, give me." But I had nothing to give him. We used to go to the market and buy horse feed.
On the collective farms, war damage and the death of so many workers at the front were deepening a grave food shortage.
I took a trip down through the Ukraine, and it was the time of the 47 famine that was going on down there, about which nothing was heard in the outside world. Soviets were talking about great grain harvests and everything else. We got down there, on the train stops, you would see children with distended bellies begging for bread. At the in Odessa itself, people lying out on the streets outside the hospitals where they couldn't take them in, starving to death. There was malnutrition everywhere.
In Germany, too, hunger and disease were spreading. The nightmare of the Western Allies was that poverty would drive the Germans towards communism.
There was never enough food. We were always hungry. In those days, we went on scavenging trips. We went to farmers and begged. Sometimes we got something, other times nothing.
America's General Lucius Clay reflected, "There is no choice between being a communist on 1,500 calories a day and a believer in democracy on 1,000. Aid to Germany cost Britain over $1 million a day. But British supplies were not enough to save thousands of Germans who died that winter for lack of food and fuel. Britain, too, was weakening. The fierce winter of 1946-47 brought industry to a standstill. The country's economy, undermined by 6 years of war, began to seize up. Coal ran out, electricity failed, and food rationing grew even tighter.
You know, people forget again, we never had bread rationing during the war. We had bread rationing after it. And that was because we were pouring wheat into Germany to prevent mass starvation there.
That was a bad winter altogether. It was cold and the crops were bad. People were unhappy. And the communists were making strenuous gains here, there, and the other place, particularly in Italy and in France, but also in Germany.
The British could no longer afford all their heavy commitments in the Mediterranean. They told the Americans they intended to pull out.
The message came, and it was flat. It said, Great Britain is withdrawing from both economic aid and military aid to Greece and Turkey.
This simply crystallized the opinions in the executive branch that the United States had to move, and move very, very quickly.
The prospect didn't look good at all for Europe or for the United States or for anybody.
In Washington, President Truman went to Congress. From now on, he announced, the United States would contain the advance of communism anywhere on the globe. This, at last, was the official declaration of the Cold War